Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our virtual legislative update for this year. My name is Tim Sink. I am president of the Greater Concord Chamber of Commerce, and we're delighted to have you here. This is an annual event, and we're doing it virtually this year, obviously. We hope that before too long, we can start bringing folks together face-to-face again. It's looking good out there as time goes by and we all get inoculated. But very glad that you were able to join us here today for this virtual event. My first order of business, I really want to thank Ledyard Bank. Kathy Underwood is here with us. She is president and CEO of Ledyard. They are a sponsor of today's event. We're grateful for their participation. And Kathy will be joining us in just a second to introduce our facilitator. But before we do that, just a couple of really brief announcements I wanted to bring your attention to. We've got some very interesting programming coming up that you may be interested in. But the first thing I want to mention is a brand new grant program through the Chamber of Commerce. Local residents Glenn and Suzanne Curry have done a challenge grant for us to help us raise some money to help small businesses. So they provided us with a grant, and we were able to match that through the generosity of Northeast Delta Dental, Merrimack County Savings Bank, Bangor Savings Bank, Ledyard National Bank, and Grapponi Automotive. So if you're a small business in Concord and you're really struggling with COVID, go to the Chamber website, give us a call. We'll give you a link. There's a very simple application form to fill out. And these are grants for up to $2,000 to help you just get through the next few months of COVID. So take a look at that grant opportunity. It's simple and intentionally uncomplicated. So moving on, we've got a few events I want to bring your attention to. Our next webinar is in partnership with the SBA. It is Disaster Programs to Assist Small Businesses, and that is Thursday, March 18th at 10:30. So, and all these events you can find on the landing page at our website to register. Very simple, one click, and they don't cost anything. So if you're interested, take a look at that for the 18th. Then at the end of this month, we have our Citizen of the Year celebration. This is an event March 30th from 4 to 5:15 p.m. And this event will be broadcast from the Bank of New Hampshire stage in downtown Concord. The event, most people will be attending virtually, but there will be some live streaming involved. Great event. We're recognizing 2 outstanding individuals, so please take a look at that. And moving along, we have our business showcase coming, the 30th annual business showcase. This again will be virtual. It's Tuesday, April 13th from 3 to 5. We're using a very interesting platform called Remo. If you haven't used it yet, you're going to have fun with this. It's a great way to move around a room and network with people that you recognize within the room virtually. And also we will be doing some live streaming. So those are some things to take a look at coming up at the Chamber. And we hope you'll jump on our website and register for some of those events. And at this point, again, thank you, Ledyard National Bank, and thank you, Kathy Underwood, for being with us today to introduce our facilitator and get the panel going.
Thanks so much, Tim. You know, it's been almost 5 years since Ledyard opened its first office in Concord. And about 6 months ago, we opened a full service branch in Concord. And during that time, we've had a fabulous relationship with the Chamber, a chamber that we consider to be one of the best in the state. And we've really enjoyed the educational programs that you have put on, particularly today's program. This is our 4th year in sponsoring this legislative session overview. And we've always enjoyed this program. It's always very informative and a delight to be here. So I'm very happy today to introduce the moderator of today's program. Ari Pollock is a shareholder of and director of Gallagher, Callahan, and Gartrell. And really, Ari doesn't need much of an introduction. We all know him as a major contributor to the community, but he represents businesses, construction, land use development, environmental clients, on a variety of land use permitting, development, environmental, and litigation matters. Importantly, he serves on the board of directors for the Concord Chamber And also he is the State Government Affairs Committee Chair for the Chamber. So very important role. And I will now turn it over to you. Thanks
Thanks
for
so much,
being here
Kathy.
today.
Thank you, Kathy. Appreciate that. Congratulations to Ledyard on your new branch. It looks wonderful. Let me take a couple of minutes to introduce our distinguished panelists back for another year of legislative updates, this year on a virtual forum, but certainly a distinguished panel yet again. Today's format is about 10 minutes of remarks from each of our panelists and then a Q&A session at the end. So please bring up your Q&A blog, type in any questions that strike you as the presentations roll off, and then we'll try to save some time at the end. In no particular order, our speakers today are Dean Spiliotis. Dean is a civic scholar in the School of Arts and Sciences at Southern New Hampshire University. He's also the founder of the blog NewHampshirePoliticalCapital.com. Dean's work focuses on presidential politics and policy, campaigns and elections, and New Hampshire's politics and its presidential primary. Dean provides frequent political analysis for local and national media outlets. He's a regular contributor on New Hampshire Public Radio's Friday New Hampshire News Roundup. He earned his PhD in poli-sci from the University of Chicago. And before today's session is over, he's going to tell us whether the Republican Party can survive the Trump era. Next will be Phil Sletten. Phil is a senior policy analyst at the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. He's worked there for more than 4 years, and he conducts research and analysis on the state budget, state revenues, expenditures, the economy, health policy, and now the effects of pandemics. He previously served as a performance auditor for the New Hampshire Office of the Legislative Budget Assistant, where he conducted an analysis on a wide range of state agency operations. Phil was recently named one of the union leaders 40 under 40, and he was the 2020 Young Professional of the Year by the Greater Concord Chamber of Commerce. Welcome, Phil. Dave Juvet will be last but never least. Dave is a graduate of the Arizona State University, where he worshiped Sparky the Sun Devil and received a bachelor's degree in history and political science. Dave began his career with the BIA, New Hampshire statewide Chamber of Commerce, in 2000 as a vice president, and was promoted to senior vice president in 2008. Dave guides public policy development and legislative activity for the BIA and supervises its very qualified lobbying team. Dave served as a gubernatorial appointee to the New Hampshire Workforce Investment Board, and he's also serving on the Reaching Higher New Hampshire board. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you.
So, as I mentioned, we're going to do about 10 minutes per panelist, and then we'll have time for questions. And without further delay, let's recognize Dean Spiliotis and ask for his remarks. Good morning, Dean. You're muted. Just unmute yourself, Dean. The power of Zoom. We want to hear from you.
Thank you, Ari. I've done probably 1 million of these in the last year, and still probably once a week or once a month, I forget to unmute myself. So apologies. And muting can be very useful at times, but it's not helpful when you're trying to speak. Well, thanks again, Ari, for that introduction, and good morning to all of my fellow panelists. I'm always excited to be here to do this event. I've always enjoyed doing it in person, and hopefully we'll be back there again soon in the not too distant future. But I'm also happy to do this virtually as well. And I think it's amazing to me how all of us at some level have gotten increasingly comfortable with this new reality over the past year. I've been teaching remotely since after spring break of last year, since March of 2020. So it's kind of become a new normal. We'll see what it's like to go back to doing things in person again, hopefully in the not too distant future. I always enjoy doing these panels because it makes me take stock of what it is that I'm most focused on in terms of state politics in the state legislature. And right now I'm focused primarily on 4 issues or items, and I'll run through those briefly, and then we can circle back to them during the Q&A. The first thing I'm focused on right now is the issue of voting rights and electoral reform. We know that in the wake of President Trump's loss in the 2020 election, there's been a move in a number of state legislatures, places like Georgia and Pennsylvania, Arizona, New Hampshire has been very active and is even getting some national visibility as a result of some of the measures that are being debated in the state legislature right now. And this is this issue of whether or not there's voter fraud. And I'll be very upfront about this. I've been consistent going all the way back to President Trump's Voter Integrity Commission in the wake of him losing the popular vote by 3 million votes in 2016. I thought that that commission was ill-advised. As I predicted, it collapsed pretty quickly because there was just no evidence of systemic voter fraud in 2016. We now know that it was a strategy of President Trump to talk about voter fraud in order to deal with the possibility that he might lose the election. And as a result, we're now dealing at the state level in a variety of states with questions of voter fraud. The kind of confidence of voters in the system, fair or not, has been, I think, undercut to some extent. And you're seeing a movement in a number of state legislatures, Republican state legislatures around the country to either, in their mind, reform, but in Democratic minds, restrict access to the ballot. So we've had at least a half dozen measures that are now under discussion at the State House in committee. We had a hearing yesterday, a number of bills dealing with college students. One bill would have banned students from using their college IDs to register to vote or as ID at the polling place. That was defeated. But there were several other bills as well, one dealing with if students register to vote in the state, they would be required to receive in-state tuition from the state schools, which would be a losing financial proposition for our state educational institutions. They're not happy about that. There are other measures dealing with student residency as well. Most of that stuff has been either defeated or retained for now, which means it could pop up again in the next session. But this has been an ongoing issue for Republicans who feel that out-of-state college students carry too much sway in places like Durham and Hanover and Plymouth and Keene, and have an effect on our local elections. So that's one aspect of voting rights that is being considered, but there are others as well. You know, in the wake of COVID-19, we had the ability to use that as a reason for voting absentee. Many New Hampshireites took advantage of that and voted by mail-in ballot. I know I did it for the first time since I was in college about 40 years ago, 35 years or so ago, maybe even longer, almost 40 years ago, voted absentee. I did it again this time for the first time, as did many of my friends and family. There's now a question of whether or not we will have that so-called no excuse absentee voting in the future. Other states are trying to restrict that. There's another piece of legislation that would deal with possibly doing away with same-day voter registration in the state, requiring a social security number or driver's license to request an absentee ballot. So there are at least a half dozen measures that are moving through the state legislature. Another one dealing with provisional ballots when you show up to vote but you don't have the proper ID, trying to make the conditions for using a provisional ballot a little bit more difficult. And so I'm fully aware this is a very polarizing aspect of our state and national politics at the moment. You know, my professional opinion, I have not seen any systemic voter fraud. And you look at what's going on in some of these states, and some of the measures being pushed don't really have a lot to do with reforming fraud. They're basically ways to limit access to the ballot. And it's become very polarizing. I imagine it's going to carry on through the next couple of elections. So that's the first. Oh, and I should also throw in the final area that I'm following in terms of voting rights and voting, et cetera, is redistricting. As you know, every 10 years after the census, states redraw their boundaries, their congressional, their legislative boundaries as part of the redistricting process. It's in the Constitution. The vast majority of states, about 34 or 35, that's typically viewed as a spoils of victory. To the victor goes the spoils. There are some states that are now trying to take partisanship out of that, but most states, it's still a partisan exercise. So there's been discussion and proposals in the state legislature about, how do you guarantee that that's transparent? Democrats in the last session had proposed, and even before, had proposed a nonpartisan voting commission. Governor Sununu vetoed that, I think twice. And now there are additional bills. And the Democrats had proposed a piece of legislation that I think was defeated to require that they get the same resources for redistricting that the Republicans get. This is going to go forward. It's a little bit delayed. I think this will start to gain steam in the fall. Governor Sununu said, I think just yesterday or the day before, that whatever redrawn boundaries come out of this process need to pass the quote smell test. And so I think he's gonna try to push for transparency. There had been some suggestion among Republicans in the state that at least one of those congressional districts, probably the first CD, would be redrawn to favor a Republican member of Congress. We'll see if all that happens. The Supreme Court has said that while you can't gerrymander based on race, that they are not getting involved in for the most part, in partisanship and gerrymandering. That's a state level issue and may involve the state courts at some point in the future. So a whole host, I think I just ran through 6 or 7 items that are in various stages of development in the legislative agenda over at the State House. The second area that I'm focused on is education. Obviously, as a professor, although not a secondary school teacher, I find this very interesting. This is a longstanding division between Republicans and Democrats, going back to debates over school vouchers in the 1980s. We're still talking about them today. There's a big debate in the state about how you deal with expanding charter schools, how you fund public schools, whether or not we should have these. I think there's a proposal for what they call education savings accounts, where you could, like a voucher, where you could essentially channel your students' funds to the school or homeschooling environment of your choice. There's a real debate there about whether or not we would be channeling public funds into private circumstances. So there are a number of school funding issues, expanding charter schools, whether or not money should be portable and be allowed to be directed to private, parochial, and homeschooling. There's debate now. Again, goes back to at least 20 years. The funding formula for per pupil funding in the state. Governor Sununu said just yesterday or the day before that he has more money in the budget for students than any previous budget. I will defer to Phil on that. I'm sure we'll hear about that. And then the final issue on education is this proposal by Governor Sununu to merge the university system with the community college system as a way of increasing efficiencies. I don't have the kind of a full sense yet of how that's going to play out, but it's something that he seems to be really interested in pursuing. Let me check time here. A couple minutes left. So education is a second big area. It's just this ongoing debate about the funding of public schools, the formula for an adequate education for students. Should you be able to channel funds for your children into whatever educational environment you would like? And then again, creating these efficiencies with our university and community college system. The third area that is kind of always there to some level, but I think it's bumped up in recent years, I think because of the increasing polarization in our country ideologically, the culture wars. I'm starting to hear that phrase a lot again in a way that I haven't heard in a number of years. And we're seeing a number of items that are typically kind of culture war is kind of a catch-all for a variety of social issues, economic issues. And in that area, we're seeing renewed proposals by state GOP Republican legislators to further restrict access to abortion. We're seeing a debate right now over whether or not transgender youth should be allowed to participate in school sports. That's a debate that's going on around the country. Several governors, I think, either have or are about to sign legislation that would prohibit that. We're having that debate here in New Hampshire as well right now. And there was also a proposal by some Republicans to ban teaching of systemic racism and sexism, cultural bias in public schools. Governor Sununu he said he probably does not support that. He thinks whether you like it or not, it would be an infringement on free speech. We'll see how that plays out. So there are a number of these issues are there periodically, but it's something I think in the wake of the Republican victory at the presidential level, I think a number of Republicans at the state level are kind of pushing this as a counterbalance to the Biden administration and their view that he is being pushed too far to the left by progressives. I think it's trickling down to the state level. And finally, the last thing I'll say as I wrap up here is I'm keeping an eye on Governor Sununu and whether or not he's going to run for Senate in 2 years against Senator Hassan. And in particular, how he responds to a lot of these issues, particularly those that are proposed by the kind of Trump wing of the state Republican Party. Governor Sununu has very masterfully separated himself from President Trump over the last several terms in office. If you remember, when he was first in office, he talked a lot about his ability to work with the Trump administration, his ability to get stuff out of the bureaucracy for New Hampshire. And then over time, he has increasingly distanced himself. There are some real upsides to that, but there are also some potential dangers as well in terms of getting support. So how he responds to a number of these issues that I've mentioned may or may not affect his ability to draw independents in a potential Senate election in 2022. The other issue I would say with him is he seems to like being a chief executive. Going to the Senate, you're only one of 100. I think Governor Shaheen, now Senator Shaheen, and Governor Hassan, now Senator Hassan, have adapted well. But others have moved in the opposite direction. Asa Hutchinson, governor of Arkansas, was a senator, moved to the governor's office. Mike DeWine in Ohio is a senator, moved to the governor's office in Ohio. So it goes both ways. The most recent polling from St. A's out yesterday has him at 47 and Hassan at 41. I think it's basically a dead heat at this point. I think Democrats have to be careful about turnout. The first midterm after Democrats take the presidency is typically a depressed turnout, but we shall see. Everything is kind of heightened right now, so maybe that won't be the case for Democrats. And finally, I'll say maybe in 25 years, we will see Governor Sununu run for president against Pete Buttigieg or maybe Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, because they're all young. They can all wait 20 to 30 years to run for president if they'd like. And I don't think we've heard the last from any of them. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. I have about 15 questions that I could ask right this minute. But rather than do that, let's please ask our other panelists to take their swing. And next we'll recognize Phil Sletten.
Right. Thank you very much, Ari. And thank you again to the Greater Concord Chamber of Commerce for having us all here. It's a fun event every year. I was also honored to be recognized by the Greater Concord Chamber of Commerce. It's only during a pandemic, when you don't have to put up with me in person, that I get such recognition, I think. So thank you very much. I was honored and surprised. So I want to talk, I'll focus, as the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute does this around this time of year, I'll focus a lot of attention on the state budget. But I do want to note that these are remarkably volatile and fast-moving conditions around this legislative session. So in a normal year, after the governor introduces his budget proposal, it goes to the House first, and then after that to the Senate. In a normal year, some of the significant shifts are around revenue forecasts, and there may be quite a bit of difference between the House version of the budget and the Senate version of the budget, because revenue forecasts have shifted some tens of millions of dollars, and that's usually considered significant. Well, 9 months ago, the best forecast we had suggested we could have a revenue shortfall this state fiscal year of anywhere from $200 to $400 million. And right now, this state fiscal year, not counting the last one, but this one, the state has a $100 million surplus. That could disappear, but it is a dramatic change in fortunes that shows just how dynamic and fast-moving these conditions are. In addition, the state's going to receive an influx in federal funds, with the federal legislation that just passed this week, of at least $500 million and likely more. and the state can deploy those relatively flexibly, not completely flexibly, but relatively flexibly. And then that leads to questions of how will it be deployed? How will it be deployed in terms of relative to the state budget and state budget services as well? And how does that impact the economy? Vaccine rollout. What is the uptake rate? How smoothly does the rollout go? How effective are the vaccines in the short, medium, and long term against any new variants that we have? That all has a substantial impact on what the next 2 years look like. And it's worth also remembering that we've never had, in the modern era anyway, an economic recovery from this sort of crisis. So we don't really know what it will look like. We are there's a lot of uncertainty around the economic forecast because we're not certain what the next several months and years looks like when it comes to a recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. So the next state budget comes at a really critical time in that recovery. It's the first two sort of complete state fiscal years, if you will, of what will hopefully be a strong and robust recovery from this crisis. And it has helped that the personal incomes of generally of higher income people have held up. A lot of people who are able to work remotely and work from home, those incomes in some cases have been completely uninterrupted. And that's, again, not what you see necessarily in a usual recession. And even more critically, federal efforts to provide relief and stimulus have carried a lot of people through the crisis and enabled people to come out of this crisis with more resources than they would have otherwise. However, in the last recovery, especially in New Hampshire, slow economic growth, particularly slow wage growth for low-wage workers, especially in the first half of the recovery, likely held back the state's economy. And it also meant that those individuals and families likely had less savings going into the pandemic than they would have if wages had grown in line with the economy, if income growth or had grown in line with income growth seen by higher wage workers, or even kept up with inflation, which wages at the low end in New Hampshire did not until sort of the second half of the recovery did they catch up. So we've seen significant federal and state policy interventions to support people through the pandemic, and the next 2 years will shape to the extent to which this is a robust, equitable, and sustainable economic recovery. And federal efforts up to this point have been essential to get us to the point where we are now, but public policy will need to be intentional and purposeful to make sure this recovery reaches those who've been hardest hit by this crisis. Which are people from families and communities with low incomes, people who identify as racial and ethnic member of a racial or ethnic minority group in the state, and workers in direct service and, again, typically low-wage jobs. Those are national trends, and the available data suggests New Hampshire has not been immune to those national trends. Those things have been happening here as well. So, to this legislative session, in terms of what I'll be watching for and what I think is on the minds of policymakers, the state budget's an opportunity to support that economic recovery. And again, this really critical period coming up. The services to help people engage in the economy will be critical. So I'll be watching what happens in the state budget and other state investments with regard to childcare, support for local public schools so they can fully open and stay open safely, education and training opportunities for workers who have been displaced during the pandemic or who may not be seeing their jobs coming back. Also places where needs have been exacerbated by the crisis, mental and behavioral health services, drug and opioid abuse, reimbursements for Medicaid services as more people have become eligible for and enrolled in Medicaid. All of these are both public health and workforce concerns. Our workforce, particularly our workforce in New Hampshire to support health services for people with low incomes, was constrained going into this crisis. And what resources are deployed to make sure that we are resilient in, for example, the face of new variants, if vaccine effectiveness is reduced over time, even if a sufficient number of people take it. Not all of humanity is going to be vaccinated quickly. So there's, I think, quite a bit of opportunity for new variants to develop and then spread around the world again. And there's questions around, there's appropriate questions around how do policymakers build in resilience to that, especially for care for older adults in congregate living settings such as nursing homes, those who are receiving services at home or in community-based settings, and also housing solutions. What does the state do around housing to enable a little bit more resilience in that in those conditions? And again, speaking of housing, The state government received about $200 million from the federal government to deploy for housing assistance, particularly rental assistance. So I'll be looking to see how it reaches people with the most acute needs, but also how it helps, if at all, with the long-term housing constraint we have in the state. Single-family home prices have risen, putting home ownership further out of reach for many low and middle income people. This puts pressure then on the rental market too, as more people stay in rental units. And leaves fewer units available for people to come into New Hampshire and to grow our workforce. And whether it's rental units or housing units, there's not a lot of opportunity for that right now. And rising prices also leave less money available for people to spend on other goods and services in the economy, as more is taken up by rent, for example. And it also increases the risk of eviction and homelessness. These are areas where, again, policymakers may be able to address some of these concerns. Because even going into this crisis, nearly half of renter households in New Hampshire were paying 30% or more of their income in rent and utilities. And that's, again, before COVID-19. And these households were also disproportionately lower income, and the pandemic has affected those workers more. So the governor did release his proposed budget, and it's currently being reviewed and discussed in the House in the first part of the legislative process. The governor proposed increasing funds for several key services, including harnessing federal funds to combat the opioid crisis, and significant new investments with state dollars in acute psychiatric services, including a new secure facility on the grounds of New Hampshire Hospital. There is a drop in investment related to childcare services in proposal relative to the prior year, as well as services for those with developmental disabilities in the first year of the governor's budget proposal. The governor does propose a new family leave program with state employees as sort of the initial pool for that, and the ability for other entities and individuals to join in. And there is also a reduction in funding for local public schools relative to the current state budget in the governor's proposal. The governor is not repeating what in the current budget in this current fiscal year was identified as one-time funds and were set up that way in statute. The governor would not repeat those. Those one-time funds include, not repeating those funds leads to reduced funding for school districts with higher concentrations of low-income families or students from low-income families. I'll note the governor does provide flexibility in his budget proposal for school districts that see reduced enrollment as a result of federal policy changes in free and reduced price school meal eligible students, which is an indicator of poverty and low-income students. The governor provides flexibility for those school districts to use pre-pandemic numbers, which likely at least somewhat more reflects the actual need. There's also, under the governor's proposal, less aid targeted to communities that have lower relative property wealth per student. Again, those were one-time dollars that were in this current state budget that the governor does not repeat. And there's also, the governor does propose an increase in aid for certain types of school infrastructures, particularly around safety and security, and expanding aid to explicitly permit energy efficient school buses to be included in that. There's also additional one-time funds in the current state budget that were distributed to cities and towns, about $20 million a year, that the governor is not repeating in his budget proposal. He did propose allocating more money through the meals and rentals tax distribution formula to cities and towns, but the increase on that will depend on revenues from that tax. So it's less aid overall than the $20 million a year in the current state budget. Counties would also be expected to pay a larger share of certain Medicaid costs, which would likely get passed on to property taxpayers. The governor's budget envisions counties paying about $47.5 million more during this biennium than they did last biennium, which is about a 20% increase in this cost for counties. And additionally, the governor proposed tax policy changes in his budget, including, which in total is a reduction of about $52 million in general and education trust funds. That incorporates reducing the meals and rentals tax rate and the business enterprise tax rate, and then phasing out and eliminating the interest and dividends tax completely by 2027. This tax in particular, the interest and dividends tax, was just over 8% of all general fund revenue in the most recently completed fiscal year. So that would be a significant impact on revenue over time. And I think it's important to note again as that there were a lot of other things in the governor's budget proposal, but there are many moving parts this session, and we have a significant amount of evidence as we enter the recovery phase, hopefully, from the COVID-19 crisis, that assistance to those with limited means is also good economic stimulus. Increasing food stamp benefits and unemployment compensation are among the most effective economic stimulus. The federal government has stepped up in that regard several times over the last year. And there are also evidence that tax rate reductions, especially on people or entities with higher incomes, is historically less effective at stimulating the economy based on modeling from Moody's Analytics and the Congressional Budget Office. So keeping services running and enhanced for people in need and keeping and getting resources to those who will deploy those dollars into the economy quickly, both helps them make ends meet, helps those individuals and families make ends meet, but also efficiently and effectively stimulates the economy. So I'll be watching to see what provisions in the state budget and otherwise in other pieces of legislation that may or may not get wrapped into the state budget will affect the economy in that way in New Hampshire over the next 2-year period, because those efforts might have a big impact on what the economic recovery looks like in the state. So I'll wrap up there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Phil. Great job as always. Our final panelist for this morning is Dave Juvet. Dave, we've got plenty of time for you, so have at it.
I'm going to do my best to get us back on schedule for Q&A, Ari. Thank you to the Chamber for inviting me to participate in this. It's always an interesting discussion. Before the program began, the panelists were talking about the impact COVID had on strategic plans for trade associations and chambers and individual businesses, and it really caused a lot of those strategic plans to be thrown out the window. And we all had to pivot to meet the new challenges that the pandemic brought upon us. The same is somewhat true in the legislative arena. Those of us who work as lobbyists or public affairs advocates and so on, going into the election last year, I think most of us, if not all of us, were expecting Democrats to retain control of the House and Senate here in New Hampshire. I think we all thought that Governor Sununu would win the re-election as he did, but many of us, including me, were really surprised when Republicans took control of the House and took control in the Senate, especially because it was somewhat contrary to what was happening around the rest of the country, and certainly contrary to what happened in the federal election. The reason I mention that is because both parties, Democrats and Republicans, have what I would call signature issues. For Democrats, their signature issues are mandatory paid family leave and an increase in the minimum wage. For Republicans, Dean already mentioned a couple of them, but there are things like school vouchers, voting reform, and certainly business tax cuts. And when you have a change in power at the State House, especially when both chambers have a change in power, it causes you to readjust your strategic plan going into the session. One thing we haven't talked a lot about this session is legislation relating specifically to issues created by the pandemic. And there's several that the BIA is working on very closely. One is a creation of a legal safe harbor for businesses who are doing the right thing. And what we mean by that is businesses that are complying with state and federal health and safety guidelines should have some level of comfort that they can't be sued by individuals for if those individuals are claiming that they got COVID-19 at the work site. There are several different bills dealing with this. Another direct piece of legislation relating to COVID has to do with the federal Paycheck Protection Program. Many small businesses, companies of all size, applied and received Paycheck Protection Program loans from the Federal CARES Act. And then there was a component of that program that allowed those loans to be forgiven. And many of them were. The companies were able to provide documentation that allowed for loan forgiveness. This created a problem at both the federal and state level in terms of taxation. How would that loan forgiveness, which now turns a loan essentially into a grant, be taxed? The federal government never intended for it to be taxed at the federal level, and in the most recent Coronavirus Stimulus Act, they quickly corrected that. So businesses do not need to be worried if they had loan forgiveness about being taxed at the federal level. They still need to worry about being taxed at the state level. Our State Department of Revenue Administration issued a release about a month ago saying that if your loan was forgiven, that money is going to be taxed under the state's business profits tax. This is incredibly harmful because keep in mind the businesses that got these loans were struggling to stay in business. And so now being taxed on that, and it's a significant tax, the department estimates it could be as high as 130 million, will create a hardship. There's legislation to try and provide the same fix at the state level as at the federal level. And we'll see how that goes through. The third area, and this gets back to a change in power shift, because this is a partisan issue, but when the House and Senate went Republican this past election, it created an opportunity for New Hampshire to pass right-to-work legislation, which is something the BIA is very supportive of. What right-to-work means is private sector employees would not be required to either join a union or pay union agency fees for representation by the union. There are about 28 states around the country, primarily in the South and the Midwest, that are right-to-work states. Why this is a big deal for New Hampshire is not so much that there is high union penetration in the private sector, because there's not, but New Hampshire is losing out on companies that are looking to expand or relocate, but will only move to right-to-work states. So that bill has already passed the Senate, and it is coming up for a hearing soon in the House Labor Committee. I want to try and end a little short of my 10-minute time, Ari, to allow for some Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Dave. I've put a reminder in the chat to please put your questions into the Q&A panel, and you can click on that on the bottom of your screen and type those in, and I'll be able to see those and relay them to the panelists. And as we're waiting for those to populate, let me ask a few questions, because obviously this is a seminar, I think Tim would agree, that we could have over the course of a full day and not just an hour or not just 3 panelists within an hour. The first question that I've got for probably Phil, but everyone can take a shot at it. And Dave was referring to the PPP program and the loan forgiveness component of that program. But similar to that, the Main Street grant program put, I believe, $400 million out on the street in New Hampshire, a significant benefit to those who applied and were granted funds. It now is clear that there's a recall provision in process, and that some of those who received those grants, who frankly applied at a much more uncertain time and may have used those grants to either reward loyal employees or invest in equipment or pay off debt, are now looking at the strong possibility of repaying some or all of those grants. And I guess my question is whether, is that a good idea, or is it a reversal of what was to be a stimulus and a boost and a crutch for businesses that were facing unprecedented times? I'm sure you can see where I come down on that, but let's see where the rest of you land.
Yeah, so I think that there's I think that what you mentioned, a stimulus and a boost and a crutch for businesses. And I think that the interpretation of which of those it was matters to the policy here, because the way, my understanding of the provision that you're speaking of is the way it's set up is comparing 2020 to 2019 revenues, right? And allowing essentially say, if your 2020 revenues were the same or greater as your 2019, then some of that Main Street relief funding would come back. I'll note that, when the program was originally set up, it was originally set up with coronavirus relief funds from the CARES Act, the $1.25 billion that came to the state. And at that time, it had to be deployed by the end of the calendar year or before the end of the calendar year. So that money had to get out the door. Otherwise, the federal government would be recouping it from the state, right? So now the timeline for those coronavirus relief funds, or at least as of late December, the timeline for those coronavirus relief funds, the state only had 3 days between December 27th when this change passed and December 30th when the deadline was, but it was extended to the end of this year at that time. And that means now that the state is maybe reconsidering some of those thoughts around, or has been over the last several months since that happened, reconsidering some of those thoughts around how do we deploy these CARES Act coronavirus relief funds. So again, I think the question there is around, is it intended to be relief, right? Is it intended to make sure that people stay whole, or is it intended to be stimulus? In which case, then the additional dollars that are going to businesses are then effectively more likely to be economic stimulus, as opposed to just trying to maintain what was the pre-pandemic status quo there. So I think that that's the question around the intent of that program. Even though the parameters have changed, right? Sort of the timeline has changed. I think those are the questions that policymakers will be considering when they're looking at that.
Dave or Dean, anything?
Yeah, I would say, you know, any type of grant program is going to have qualifications and restrictions attached to it that the grant recipient has to comply with. This is what makes it a grant and not a gift. I'm thinking maybe the state did not emphasize to the extent that they probably should have, either how these funds had to be used, or the qualifications that might exist where the grant recipient would have to reimburse the funds. But as Phil said, we have some time to try and figure that out at this point. But it's important to remember, a grant is not a gift.
Yeah, I'll just say real quickly on the politics of PPP in general. You know, if you remember when the program first started, it was done incredibly rapidly. There was I heard a lot of politicians say, well, you know, it's inevitable that some of the money is not going to be used appropriately or go to people who don't need it. But the reality is we're in such a crisis that the money needs to get out there, and you sort of figure these things out on the fly and try to revise them as you go along. You know, our expectations about where we were headed with this crisis back in April, May, and June are different than they are now. And I think that as this has progressed over time and we've had these iterations of packages coming out from Congress, there has been some rethinking about who gets this money, what are the terms of the money, et cetera. And you may remember that with the initial round, some companies got a lot of money that probably should not have, and were tremendous social pressure on them to give it back, and some of them did.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Ari.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we may have frozen briefly there.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
You can. Okay.
Yes.
I can't hear you, but that's all right. I'll try to fix that while we move on to our next question. We've struck a chord with some of the PPP program and forgiveness conversation, and the question that's come in essentially is with allegations of fraud surrounding PPP loans, what kind of regulation or legislative action could or should be passed or considered to hold those accountable who may have been involved in fraud? Obviously, from the legal perspective, I know there's a high evidentiary burden there. It's difficult to legislate what would happen in a courtroom. But let's talk a little bit, as I try to get my speaker to work, on what legislation should be considered to address some of those abuses.
Well, let me start in on that. Dean was absolutely right. The first round came about extraordinarily quickly, especially for federal action. It was conceived of and implemented over the course of weeks rather than months or sometimes years. But there still were protections that were put into that. And Dean's right, there were some companies that were well publicized as having received the loans that probably were inappropriate. But all of the companies that received it were under restrictions about how that money could be used. And they had to demonstrate that back to the Small Business Administration and their local bank If they were unable to do that, there was no loan forgiveness, and the money they received became an actual loan, not a grant. And although the interest rate, as I recall, was very low, I think 1%, still it was something that would have to be paid back as it was a loan, and it was not just free money.
Yep. And one thing
Well,
I
you've
can
all stopped talking, so it must mean that you've finished answering that question. I didn't have a chance to hear it because my computer is not cooperating, but we can move on to another question. And this one, I'll really try to fix my speaker for, because I'm interested very much so in the answer to this one. And I think this is one that is addressed mostly to Dean. In light of the Democratic loss of control in the general court, in a redistricting year, in a budget year, and of course, with the midterm election on the horizon, what's the likelihood of Emmett Sildadi's chances of unseating Ray Buckley as party chairman, given all of the shift in dynamic and change occurring in advance of the midterms?
Well, yeah, it's hard. It's a great question. Hard to know. I will say I agree with Dave. It was a bit of a surprise that the Republicans took both chambers of the state legislature. They had this interesting result where, President Biden and our Democratic congressional delegation, the 3 seats that were up, all went very smoothly for Democrats. Yet, I think we were one of 2 legislative chambers in the country that flipped Republican. It was not a great election for Democrats at the state and local level, and that has real ramifications. There are theories in political science about balancing, that voters like to balance for incremental change. So if you're going to have Democrats at one level, maybe you have Republicans at the other. We're all still trying to figure out exactly why we had this kind of split result. That said, I think it's been interesting to see somebody challenge Ray Buckley. He's been central to the Democratic Party's expansion of its infrastructure and organizational capabilities in the state for some time now. I don't think he's been challenged in a while. We'll see. I don't have a sense yet of just how vulnerable he is. But he, certainly we're going to see a challenge that we haven't seen for a while. And there needs to be some kind of discussion among Democrats about what went wrong at the state and local level, because as Dave mentioned, this is really a recipe for kind of policy whiplash when this kind of stuff happens at the state level.
Oh, now we can't hear you, Ari. Okay. I'm assuming everybody can hear me. All right. So I'm gonna, if Ari's gonna having some technical difficulties, I did have one question I wanted to throw out to everybody, and this has to do with what happened in the last election. You saw on the national level, we went completely blue, and on the state level here in New Hampshire, we went completely red in terms of legislature and executive office. Can you folks comment a little bit on that and what your take is in terms of why that happened?
Well, I just spoke, so let me defer to my colleagues, and then I can always come back around at the end. Let them give them a chance to jump in.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't know, Tim. Like I said, I was expecting the Democrats in the House and Senate had, fairly comfortable majorities. It wasn't like it was a slender majority such as it exists in the U.S. Senate right now. It was a 14-10 majority, and I don't know what the House was, but they were at least 20 or 30 members ahead. So it's not just a shift; it's almost a seismic shift for them to be able to have flipped both chambers, the House and the Senate. And I suppose in any other year that would be surprising, but maybe not remarkable. What makes it remarkable is what Dean referred to, is that all the other races in the state for Congress, and absent the governor's race, Democrats the Democratic incumbent was comfortably reelected. And we all know what happened at the federal level. The Democrats retained their control on the House, although they lost members. A Democratic candidate won the presidency, and following the runoff elections in Georgia, Democrats obtained a about as slender as you can get majority in the Senate. So what happened in New Hampshire was really contrary to what was going on around the rest of the country, and in some ways even contrary to what our congressional elections showed.
Oh, I see.
Thanks, David. Phil, do you have any comments?
Oh, I was just noting that Ari was speaking, but we still couldn't hear it. So that was the only item.
No. Yeah, I mean, I'll just jump in real quick to one or two more thoughts that popped into my head. There are these, as I said, political science always has a theory or two to try to explain these kinds of outcomes when they happen over time. And I mentioned the balancing theory that, you vote one way at the federal level and another way at the state level to balance things out. Another theory suggests that, Democratic voters typically are more focused on national races, that in these presidential years, you get a big Democratic turnout, but they're focused more on presidential and congressional. And when you get down to the level of state and local politics, it's either A, less partisan, or B, there's just a less attention paid by one party than the other. I don't know how satisfactory I find any of those explanations, but I will say that the Democratic Party nationally, about probably 4 or 5 years ago, started prepping for the issue of redistricting after the 2020 census. They pumped a lot of money into national programs to try to either flip Democratic or not lose state legislatures. And we've seen that it has not worked out particularly well for them. And so we're going to get, just like in 2010 here in New Hampshire, we're going to get another GOP-led redistricting, and we'll see about these issues of transparency and what the governor has to say about it as well. And certainly, Governor Sununu did a lot of campaigning for local races. He's very popular in the state, and he may have had some sort of coattail effect on the local races as well. We're still sorting all this out.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Governor Sununu went into the race, as Dean said, very popular, and not just popular with Republicans, but popular with a high percentage of independents and even some Democrats. The Democratic candidate, Dan Feltus, while having a good legislative career, he was the majority leader in the Senate leading up to his running for governor, was certainly not as well known. Name recognition was obviously not as high as the incumbent Governor Sununu, and I don't know. It's possible that led to a weakness in downstream Democratic voting in the state. I'm not sure. Like I said, there were a lot of us that were surprised, and we're probably still trying to sort out how and why that happened.
Well, there was one comment by someone on the call today making a comment that's thinking that the messaging, the GOP messaging on income tax may have something to do with this. That is opinion, but I thought I'd bring that up as part of the Q&A. Ari, I think you're still probably unable to get in, but you did a fantastic job. So thank you very much. And, the surprises of Zoom, it's going to happen every once in a while, but we've got it covered, and you did a great job. And we'll definitely ask you back again next year.
What Ari needs right now are those signs that the Coyote used to hold up in the Roadrunner cartoons that say, uh-oh, or,
Well, we got through 90% of it, and so that's great. I want to thank our panel today, David Juvet, Dean Spiliotis, Phil Sletten. You guys do a fantastic job every year, and we're very grateful to have you here. So thank you for that very much. And also, again, a shout out to Ledyard Bank and CEO Kathy Underwood for sponsoring today's event. And I hope you all enjoyed this legislative update, and we hope to see you again at an upcoming chamber event in the very near future. Folks, have a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
All right.
It's always a pleasure.